The term sovereign AI has appeared recently as organizations have started to become concerned about how exposed they are or dependent they are on different capabilities that are provided by others. I'm really pleased to welcome back to the podcast Aki Ranin, who's a keynote presenter at API Days Singapore 2000 and has previously spoken at API Days Singapore. Welcome back, Aki.
Oh, thanks for having me again. Happy to be here.
So, Aki, your keynote at API Days Singapore was really insightful, but I think the big message that came through in a number of parts of your talk was about our organization's growing dependence on capabilities provided by others. And I think you used a couple of terms that really made people sit up. I guess the term sovereign, I hadn't heard about for several years until more recently with supply chain challenges caused by COVID and the war in Ukraine and more recently in the Gulf. But in AI, we have a similar challenge brewing. Could you just talk through some of that a little bit?
Yeah. So, yes, I agree that sovereignty is a sort of term you might see on the news. I think did come up in, during the COVID pandemic in many ways, mostly around like supply chains. I remember, waiting for my furniture for months, and that was the issue that is around like, certain parts. I think, certain industries like the car industry, very exposed because I think people had maybe forgotten how globalized the economy had become, that like, sort of would find the best quality and cheapest parts wherever they are. It didn't really matter, right? And you had these sort of really optimized supply chains that suddenly, when you had this kind of shock, that all went away. There was also this random incident, if you remember, when that one shipping container got stuck in
The Suez
the
Canal.
Panama Canal. Yeah, exactly.
Mm,
Whole
yeah.
nother shock. And then we've had, consequent shocks now with the Ukraine and tariffs, and then the Strait of Hormuz, et cetera. So I think people
And
are
even
sort
the
of getting,
digitization,
yeah.
the recognition that a lot of things are digitized, because my understanding is that during COVID, BMW couldn't get enough chips to put in the cars. And chips aren't something we normally think about when we think about a car, but there's so much electronics in a car these days that when BMW were unable to get chips to put in the cars, they went out and bought bunch of washing machines and took the
Mm.
chips out of those. So it's not simply commodities like sunflower oil and other things like or petroleum that we're dependent on. It's also um, digital technologies, chips
Mm.
themselves, and I guess the software that's running models these days.
Yeah, I think the segue is sort of critical infrastructure. So you could say that's like aerospace, defense, but now increasingly AI. And, the issue with AI is that supply chain is very fragile and very concentrated in a few bottlenecks. So famously, you have TSMC in Taiwan, and you've got the whole geopolitical circus there with China, which is sort of looming over the whole AI industry. You've got ASML, which does the EUV optics, the only manufacturer currently at those specific precisions that are needed for the latest generation GPUs. And then you have, if you've watched the news, say in the last year, you've seen the back and forth between, say, like NVIDIA and the White House in terms of are they or are they not allowed to export certain chips to China. So it's already become geopolitical on the hardware side. And then on top of that, you have then the further, I guess you could say, software aspects of it, where really the leading model providers in the world are either in Silicon Valley or China, mostly Silicon Valley. China is behind, debatable by how much, but they're certainly behind. And then closed versus open source. So it becomes a sort of landscape of issues that companies, I feel, have to navigate, because the default for the first 3 years of this Gen AI era was, oh, you just use ChatGPT. And in the last 12 months, I'm sure you've seen it, is like everybody's, no, now we have to move to Claude because of Claude Cowork, because of Claude Code, etc. It's
Code
just like
design.
better. It became sort of a trend in a way. Like it's a
Mm.
status that, oh, you're using ChatGPT, you're not on Claude, latest, greatest thing. But the reality is that these are all, closed models. They're from private companies that are not nonprofits. They are for profits these days, as we also know, in control of private individuals. They're subject to US government controls on tariffs, etc. We haven't seen that play out, but I think more and more companies are thinking like about who gets to decide how they use AI and what they use it for, who controls the pricing of that. And so I think it's just become a relevant topic in 2026. But then there's
Mm.
also the cost side of it that,
So just before we get to
yeah,
the cost, though, I think the dependence is not just on physical things anymore; it's also on intellectual capital. So it's not even the chips. If I run my business on an AI agent that is provided by another firm, then not only am I dependent on them to run my business, but they also get to know a lot more about my business than if they were just selling me a desk or even a laptop computer or a server. They get to know they're running my business for me. And Anthropic published a list of common applications or common topics that people are engaging with Claude recently. And if you wanted to dominate the world, then you'd probably look at gathering that information and then producing products that are specifically for that, which of course you'd think helps people, but then it also makes them even more dependent on that particular service. And the more data that they accumulate about your behavior, the more they're able to tailor your own experience and dependence on that. So it's pulling the plug and switching to another provider is so much harder than even
right.
changing from one mobile phone company to another.
Yeah, it could be impossible either for technical or legal reasons. Also, I was looking at this issue with one of my clients just yesterday. And it's not just the AI labs. It's also a lot of every company that you're buying some sort of AI service from. You're going to have to start thinking about this question of portability. That like, okay, so this looks really attractive. You're going to build my agents for me. You're going to run them for me. So that's great. These are like managed services that is very common across all sorts of IT as a sort of framework or a service pattern. But the issue is, what if you stop working with this company? Who keeps the
Mm.
agents, right? And there's a piece of news a couple of weeks ago, which wasn't super widely reported, that a startup of like 40 people running their entire business on Claude APIs was accidentally banned from that API, meaning they just got cut off without really any advance warning. For 24 hours, they were out of business. And it turned out to be just basically an accident on the side of Anthropic. But that tells you that, like, as we, there is this convergence, or like if you imagine like a Venn diagram, there's a huge overlap between what we're talking about in terms of sovereignty and then agentic AI, because agents are effectively how we're going to be running our businesses, and I think to a large degree our personal lives in the future. And then I would add a sort of third dimension into this Venn diagram, which is, you could say, open source AI or local AI. That, like you were saying, well, can I choose to, in my private life or my business, do certain things outside of sort of the frontier and the cloud based AIs, and just have something on my laptop or my local server, even on my phone. And certainly, like if you look at Apple and Google, of course, they're heavily invested in keeping the phones and the laptops and the tablets relevant. So they're, for that reason, also pushing this agenda that, like, hey, local AI can be good, and there's sort of like privacy benefits to that. But for sure,
Yeah.
I do see that.
Yeah. So the challenge, of course, is it's not easy for all of us to build our own LLM. So we need to get it from somewhere. If we don't use a commercial service out on the cloud and we
Mm,
want to install it locally, then we're looking at an open source provider, but we don't really know how it works.
yeah.
And the complexity of that is such that it's not really easy to predict what it's going to do. For most open source software, you can actually see the code, and
Mm,
a person who's skilled enough with code will be able to look at it and see, well, is it siphoning off some of my data and sending it somewhere else? But with an AI model, I'm not so sure it's so easy to pick that apart and see inside, look inside the box and see what it's doing. So it's an even deeper level of dependence on that model than most open source software.
yeah. I mean, for example, I think Apple, even though they're not really doing anything directly in AI, you might say, I think they do have a role to play in the sense of setting the operating boundaries for how AI interacts with their hardware and their sort of like app ecosystem, so that you could potentially have certain guarantees around those types of things as you're describing, that you have better maybe auditability or transparency on what is the AI doing and on what basis. Now, of course, these are largely going to be black box models, but I increasingly think that what we're going to see is, rather than just use a huge frontier model and then it just does all of your agentic work, I just don't think that even works for the cost reasons, right? Because
Hmm.
the frontier models are getting more expensive. We're moving from the sort of
Yeah.
1 trillion class models now into the 5, 10 trillion models. And you see, if you saw just 2 days ago, the new Gemini 3.5 Flash from Google, they call it a Flash model, but it's actually it's basically, I think it was like 4 times more expensive than the old Flash model. So they're still calling it a Flash, but it's more like the same price tier as the previous Pro model. And so
Mm.
if you're saying, oh, we're just going to use all these agents to run our business, like if you do the napkin math, it's going to be unbelievably expensive. So I think what you actually have to do, I spoke about this Shopify case study in the
Hmm.
keynote where
Yeah.
they showed that if you have a well-defined use case and you can, using a variety of methods, come up with a good baseline of evaluations, which is basically just to say, how can I measure whether the model is doing the right or wrong thing? Then you can try to go down the rungs, as in, okay, you start from the frontier model, whatever it is, Opus 4.7. And if it works well, then you just keep going down. And there are optimization techniques where, because models are quite different, they're trained differently, meaning that the same prompts or system prompts may not work as well with every model. So you can try to optimize it. And what they did was they went from a frontier model, which cost them like $5 million per year for this one use case, down to like a 70 billion parameter model, I believe, which cost them like 70,000 a year. And so I think this is actually what companies will do. And maybe also in your personal life, that you'll have, like, say, something like an email agent, which is actually a small
Mm.
model, just does email. You can still have the big LLM, but a lot of these tasks will be like handed off to small specialized models for cost purposes. But I think also to some degree, to your question, giving you more sort of auditability, that it's not just one giant model that can sort of kind of tell you whatever it wants and sort of fool you, to saying, okay, I see there's a sort of cascade of different agents doing certain things that gives you just more, I think, transparency around and trustworthiness with the AI.
So what were you were saying about newer models consuming more tokens? It sounds a little bit like shrinkflation. When you go to the supermarket and the product is the same price, but instead of being 250 grams, it's only 200 grams. Is that what is potentially going to happen with how we consume services? Because the metric is by which we're charged, I guess, our consumption metric is tokens. If every
Hmm.
newer model is going to consume more tokens because of the better quality, if we don't do what you said about going down the stack and seeing what is the
Yeah.
minimum viable model to
Yep.
meet my performance requirements, if we don't do that, then we're just going to have this cycle of inflation of increased
Yeah.
costs
For sure.
for running the things that we were running before.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been toying around with this concept of AI inflation, which is that, what might matter at some point is not how much money you have, but it's how much compute, how many tokens, what quality of tokens you have access to, right? If you imagine your entire business and life is running on AI, then that is sort of potentially all of the difference in a way. So there's a lot of things that can go into that, but I do think that it's increasingly something you want to uh, think about. But there's also, luckily, I would say, whilst the frontier is getting more expensive and you look at the new NVIDIA hardware that comes out every 2 years or so,
Mhm.
everything's kind of going up market. It's, more complicated and going from investing billions to trillions in terms of data centers, et cetera. That's all true. But I think there is a sort of positive counter trend, which is that these small models in the sort of sub 100 billion range, especially like the 30 billion parameter range. You had initially like the Quen models, 3.5, but now, for example, Gemma 4, which are open models, and running those on more efficient inference hardware, because agents are quite different to what we're used to think about in terms of AI hardware. If we started from like ChatGPT, that was the issue was mainly training. It's sort of like put all of the internet data in NVIDIA GPUs. You need like hundreds of thousands or even millions of them to create this like gigantic model. So that was what everybody was talking about in, up until maybe 2025. But now we're moving to inference. And, you have chips like Cerebras, who just IPO'd, and Grok, which did a sort of acqui-hire, I guess, with NVIDIA, et cetera. And I think what we're going to see is that you can have much lighter, much cheaper hardware, maybe not in your laptop. That could still be difficult. But let's say maybe you have a little box in your home, or you have a box in the office, or every, I don't know, company has we have a server room again, right? We got rid of those. We put everything in the cloud, but that might make a comeback where you just have a small server room. And that's where you can then run your sensitive agents with these smaller models that are like task specific. And you're investing maybe on a company level, like a million or a few million into this hardware. Because like I said, most companies do not have the ability to buy even one Vera Rubin system from NVIDIA. They literally cost like so much that it's sort of only things that like a handful of companies in the world can afford. So it's almost like there's a bifurcation, that there's a certain like frontier sort of AGI type of value chain and supply chain in AI, and that's dominated again by China mainly and the US. But then there will be this sort of reality where like actually you could do a lot of useful things because, the frontier guys are talking about like, oh, we solved this new mathematical proof, right? Like, but you and I, how many mathematical proofs are we doing every day? Not a lot. We're just doing emails, spreadsheets, basic math, etc. So these sort of small agents are probably in our day-to-day lives more relevant than the sort of super expensive frontier AI.
So I am running my own side project at the moment. I have a couple of Linux box mini PCs at home,
Yep.
and I've installed Hermes to
hmm
run things. And for some things, I'm still going to use Claude, but for the more personal data, I have tested different models. And unfortunately, my hardware is a little limited. So I have had to do what you described. I start with the big model and see if it works. And it just took too long. So I dropped down to the next one. I'm working on one of the Quen models at the moment in order to deploy the sorts of things that are going to look at my email, help sort through documents and the sorts of things that I don't really want to send out to
Yeah.
a different
Yeah.
service. And I see that as being more accessible. And we've also seen non-technical people do this. So
Mm.
the Singapore's foreign minister, Vivian Balakrishnan, put out a post on Facebook describing his second brain for a diplomat,
Mm.
that he's using the NeoClaw, I think, running on a
Mhm.
Raspberry Pi to help sort through his different meetings, conversations, and events that he's been to help sort through
Mhm.
those and to recall things that have been he's been involved with before but can't remember exactly. He's a pretty smart guy, but he's not a technical person, and so I think if a non-technical person can do that, then there's probably something that we can all implement for ourselves. And I guess to your point about businesses, yes, there probably will be a good reason to perhaps return to a server room. Maybe not quite as big, or as the fans may not be as loud, may not generate as much heat as before, but there's probably a good case to be made for having small server room in an organization to run those more sensitive things. What sort of capabilities, though, does an organization need in order to be able to do that? Because the
Mhm.
do-it-yourself part is attractive until you realize how much you really have to maintain in those. So, what are the sort of skill sets do you see having to
Mm.
emerge? What do we
Yeah.
all need to learn in order to get the most
Yeah. To be
out of?
honest, I think the missing piece is like a lot of people are excited about Claude and look at, what I can create with Claude, et cetera. I can create code. I don't know anything about code, but it's created this app for me, et cetera. The issue is that there's no way for you to know whether it's legit. Is it real? Is it factual? Is it correct? Can you rely on it? So there's a sort of false sense of confidence, I think, that people are getting from consumer AI tools, especially, I think, Claude. And the step up from something that you can whip up on Claude to something that needs to run your business is specifically the measurability aspect. So that's what I was saying earlier about the Shopify use case and Evals, as they call it. It's like software testing in a way for AI. You
Hmm.
just do it in a different format. It's basically questions and answers, but you need to know that if I ask you, like, okay, you've got your email assistant, you need to quantify for me if we're working in this company, and let's say I'm the CIO or head of AI or the CFO or even the CEO or COO, and you're saying, hey, you know, good news, guys, I've just automated all this like email stuff, and you can just use our agent now. Then you need to tell me what is the percentage risk of hallucinations. Like, if you can't, then it's a complete no go. Like, conversation ends right there. And the issue is with if you're just using Claude or anything sort of off the shelf, you have no way of doing that. So I think OpenClaw is very interesting and sort of Hermes in that it opened up this sort of paradigm of what agents look like. And it sort of set a template that even Claude really quickly adopted all the same things like scheduling and being able to work with like different gateways, say like on your phone and cloud versus your desktop and so on. But
Hmm.
I think what we need to add is actually this sort of process by which you can define agentic use cases, source and or curate these evals for that use case, and then do that optimization step of saying, what's the minimum viable model? I like that term that you used for this use case. And then that's just a sort of loop that you repeat. You know, I think an average company, not even a large company, has at least 100 agentic use cases that they need to do. But like, this is the way to do it. It's not going to be just using Claude. That's a no go. It's not going to be just using OpenClaw either. In many ways, that's even worse because it's gives the AI sort of more freedoms.
Hmm.
So we need to have less freedom for the AI. We need to sort of put these agents in sort of small boxes where we know what goes in and out, and we can actually quantify that. And therefore have a confidence to say, okay, there's some acceptable risk. It's never going to be 0% hallucination risk, right? It's never going to be 100.0% accuracy. And then depending on the use case, how critical it is, are you subject to regulations? You're going to have to make that determination.
The word that springs to mind as you talk through those things is governance. And I have heard the word AI governance quite a lot, but perhaps not defined down to that level that you just did, because perhaps a lot of the conversations have been, well, where are you going to let an agent go? What are you seeing in terms of organizations trying to define those boundaries that they're going to
Mm.
set for agents?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that there is such a concept. You could say that like most companies at this point should be thinking about some sort of AI policy, which just dictates, like, for example, okay, can I just use the free version of ChatGPT? In most cases, the answer should be no, because the risk is you forget that you're using the free version. You upload, I don't know, your company's like sensitive data, like your employee catalog or something in HR, and suddenly everybody's email address and phone numbers, etc., might be in the training data for OpenAI, right? Because
Yeah.
in our preamble, you mentioned this sort of concept that people are familiar with, that if you're not paying for it, then you're the product. And that is certainly true of the
Yeah.
free AI tools. They openly say it, hey, this is free. In exchange, we're keeping everything. So like basically even warning to some degree in the fine print, like, don't upload stuff you don't want us to use. So that's one sort of obvious place to start, is like just deciding what kind of AI tools can we use for what kinds of things. So if you're talking about a company, you should at least have paid subscriptions to these AI tools so that you can know that, okay, if I'm uploading sensitive information, I have some control over where it's going. I would rather you did that where you control the model. So again, going back to the concept of sovereignty. So on AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, you can have private instances where you can still use the same frontier models, but at least it's restricted. So using them via API, you have controls over, basically they're not going to use or even see logs of what you're doing with that. So you have more privacy. And then the next step is using open models. And then the next step is open models on your own hardware. And that's where you really like, you could think of that policy that is sort of a gradient depending on the use case. It would fall in one of those buckets. And you probably long term need to have all those buckets. You can't rely on just saying, oh, well, we'll just use Claude. I think that's not going to be a viable strategy long term for anybody.
Yeah, so I guess you've indicated this is what the stack should probably look like for, you use the word gradient, which I think is quite appropriate, because for certain as you get deeper into things, as you get more sensitive things that you want to use, you need to have more protection for it, and it is more core to your business, so you need to protect it more. Well, any thought on top of that as to where companies should start? Because you
Yeah.
yes should have an AI policy. What should they
Mhm.
do tomorrow? What are the earliest things that
Right.
they
Yeah. So the, the tricky piece here is like this is a moving target. So if we had this conversation a year ago, we probably may or may not have even talked about agents, right? We would have just talked about like ChatGPT, maybe not even
yeah.
Claude as much. Agents have shaken up this equation a little bit, which means the AI policy cannot be sort of a we did it in 2023 and it's good forever. It needs to be
Mm,
adapted to the circumstances as we figure out how agents, how sovereignty, how things go. And, there's a big difference between these assumptions of like, you know, as I was saying earlier, right now it looks like frontier models are becoming more exclusive, more expensive, potentially to some degree more embedded in products that you may or may not access them via the API. And then you have
mhm,
these like smaller open models that are becoming increasingly useful. That's an assumption about the future, but like how long that holds and how things shake up is also down to like geopolitics. So I think it's not realistic to say, no, let's put all these buckets in place. Like, let's get some hardware. Like, if you're not used to running that kind of thing, it's a pretty high bar. So I think you want to
yeah.
say, step one is, okay, deciding what tools we're using. You might say, ask around what tools are
Mm,
people using? Because the
yeah.
way AI
Ask
tools
for
have
what
been
to produce. Yeah.
have been adopted is like people just use their own credit cards or company credit cards. So they have individual plans or team plans. So there's like I've seen this that there's sort of a kaleidoscope of like AI adoption across even smaller companies. So first you have to catalog what are we using? And then you have to determine like, okay, between the free bucket, right? There's a lot of free AI tools and a lot of them you can use. Because if you know that the content that's going in there is not sensitive, it's sort of public information, then that's fine. Let's say you're doing something like research. It's all public information. So use whatever video
Mhm,
models and image models and sound models that are out there. That's cool. You can experiment and whatnot. But then there has to be a clear definition that, oh, this category of use cases we're doing, if it's touching emails, it's touching our corporate data on like Google Drive or Salesforce, you cannot just use some AI tool and decide, oh, I'm going to plug it into my thing. Absolutely not. We have to decide as a company that, okay, yeah, we're using ChatGPT for this, ChatGPT Business or Cloud. The next step is the biggest one because currently agents are still quite difficult to implement. We could talk about like again OpenClaw or Hermes. Those have their own issues. I don't think they're that great for businesses. But you have equivalent frameworks running on GCP. They just came out with their sort of managed agent solution. Obviously, you have like Anthropic has their managed agents. OpenAI has something similar on AWS. You have Bedrock. But a lot of those require now more technical skills, right? So then it's like, well, do we have
mm,
those technical skills? Do we have those people in our
yeah.
company that can take charge of this? Or do we need to bring in a vendor that can help us manage this? And then are we going to build agents with code that we can manage and own? Or are we going to use something like, again, a managed agent solution from Anthropic where there is a risk of portability that we may or may not get to keep that IP, as it were. So I think
Mhm,
this area is evolving now rapidly of like, how do we build agents? Do we do, drag and drop agents or do we do code agents? And where are we building those? Do we own the code or do we just have a contract with somebody? So that decision, I don't know that there's necessarily now like a clear strategy that every company must adopt the same thing. But I think this is now a
mm,
discussion that has to take place because agents are coming. Every company will have tons of agents by the end of the year. And you don't want to make a false or wrong decision there that suddenly you find out, next year that I didn't realize, but actually we've building this outside of our company and now we're cut out. We can't keep these. We can't move these. We're stuck with something. You don't want to have that happen.
Well, thanks very much, Aki, for sharing that. I guess is an approach to think about how you build an AI strategy and policy around use. We'll put a link to your Substack in the show notes. But is there anything else you'd like to share as a sort of parting word?
Yeah, I think one issue that I see in a lot of companies is just the ownership question, as in, these kind of issues that we've been discussing here. Who gets to decide? Is there a person? Is there a
Mhm.
dedicated head of AI, or is this like a management team, or is this a CIO or a CTO? I think, putting together some sort of steering group around AI policy, AI governance is a pretty good move to make it a little bit more multidisciplinary, sort of raise it up the chain. Don't just say, you know, kind of
It's
like
a
push it
technical
down the
call.
chain and
Yeah.
say, oh, well, you're the AI guy, you decide. I think AI is so strategic. And as AI agents over the next year or two will increasingly sort of get permeated or embedded into business processes and stuff, we really have to, I think of this as more business transformation, not just like technology transformation. So therefore, it sort of belongs maybe even at the board level in terms of having this debate now. Like, okay, what assumptions are we making? Where are we in the world? Are we subject to China or Silicon Valley or Europe or the Middle East or Russia, et cetera, in terms of the geopolitical aspects? And like, how does that influence our decision making? That, are there providers in our region or our country that we should try to work with, as opposed to just saying use Claude like everybody else?
Thanks for sharing that, Aki. Once again, it's been a real pleasure talking with you, and I think the audience is really going to appreciate the insights and from the expertise that you bring. Thanks.
Thanks for having me, John. My pleasure.